Okay, today we're going to talk about the environmental movement as part of our unit on an era of protest and change. So first we're going to talk about environmental activists speaking out. We're going to take a look at this book, Silent Spring, which was a watershed for the environmentalism movement.
In 1958, Rachel Carson received a letter describing songbirds suddenly dropping from tree branches. The writer blamed their deaths on a pesticide called DDT that exterminators had sprayed on a nearby marsh. The letter was the push Carson needed to investigate DDT. She had already heard from scientists and conservationists who were worried that rampant use of the pesticide posed a threat to fish, birds, and possibly humans. She began to make inquiries through government contacts from her years working in the United States Bureau of Fisheries. She asked, "What has already silenced the voices of spring?" In 1962, Carson published her findings in Silent Spring. Her book documented the misuse of chemicals and their toll on nature and human health. Silent Spring immediately drew both applause and impassioned dissent, along with vicious personal attacks on the author. How did this mild-mannered biologist and writer ignite such controversy? Carson began her career as a hard-working graduate student, balancing her studies in biology at Johns Hopkins University with part-time jobs. Still, she had to leave school before completing her doctorate to provide for her ailing father and sister. Carson found part-time work with the Bureau of Fisheries, writing for a radio program on marine biology. Her ability to write materials that could hold the general public's attention impressed her superiors, and in 1936, she became the second woman to be hired at the Bureau full-time. In 1941, she published the first of 3 books on the ocean, combining science with lyrical meditations on underwater worlds. These explorations resonated with a wide audience. In Silent Spring, Carson turned her attention to the ways human actions threaten the balance of nature. DDT was originally used during World War II to shield crops from insects and protect soldiers from insect-borne diseases. After the war, it was routinely sprayed in wide swaths to fight pests, often with unforeseen results. One attempt to eradicate fire ants in the southern U.S. killed wildlife indiscriminately, but did little to eliminate the ants. In spite of this and other mishaps, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and chemical companies extolled the benefits of DDT. There was little regulation or public awareness about its potential harm, but Carson showed how the overuse of chemicals led to the evolution of resistant species, which, in turn, encouraged the development of deadlier chemicals. Since DDT does not dissolve in water, she asserted that over time it would accumulate in the environment. The bodies of insects, the tissues of animals who consume those insects, and eventually humans. She suggested that exposure to DDT might alter the structure of genes with unknown consequences for future generations. The response to Silent Spring was explosive. For many people, the book was a call to regulate substances capable of catastrophic harm. Others objected that Carson hadn't mentioned DDT's role controlling the threat insects posed to human health. Former Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson demanded to know why a spinster with no children was so concerned about genetics, and dismissed Carson as probably a communist. A lawyer for a pesticide manufacturer alluded to Carson and her supporters as sinister influences, aiming to paint businesses as immoral. In reality, Carson had focused on the dangers of chemicals because they weren't widely understood, while the merits were well publicized. She rejected the prevailing belief that humans should and could control nature. Instead, she challenged people to cultivate maturity and mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. Carson died of cancer in 1964, only 2 years after the publication of Silent Spring. Her work galvanized a generation of environmental activists. activists. In 1969, under pressure from environmentalists, Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act that required federal agencies to evaluate environmental impacts of their actions. To enforce the act, President Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, and in 1972, the EPA issued a partial ban on the use of DDT. Long after her death, Rachel Carson continued to advocate for nature through the lingering impact of her writing.
Americans embraced the arguments of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, and Congress began restricting the use of pesticides. Soon after, in April 27th, 1970, there was the very first Earth Day was organized. This was a protest day that was designed to push the issue of the environment into the national spotlight politically. Again, this was galvanized by her book. Her book really did send national attention in the direction of protecting the environment for the sake of human health. Backed by traditional conservation groups that now became more active in call for environmental protections, has become a worldwide day of celebration every April. But this first Earth Day was a rather momentous occasion that had some very significant effects in the immediate political sphere. For example, just 3 months after the first Earth Day, President Nixon proposed the Environmental Protection Agency, and it was ultimately founded later on that year in December, and it was given the responsibility of protecting the environment. Again, for the purpose, of course, being protecting the environment so that humans can thrive in a healthy way in the environment. Its founding and activities led to passing of Clean Air Acts, Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. So what we're seeing is the government finally realizing that it needs to be responsible to make sure our water is drinkable and our air is breathable for the foreseeable future.
Once one of the most polluted rivers in the U.S., the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, caught fire 13 times in 1 century due to the lack of sewer and waste disposal regulation. A 1969 fire over 5 stories high inspired national attention, the passage of the Clean Water Act, and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. The EPA consolidated federal research, monitoring, and enforcement in one agency to protect human health and the air, water, and land. The EPA is authorized to set national air quality, auto emission, and anti-pollution standards. Using the best available scientific information, the EPA reduces environmental risks and protects the public and the environment. To make this mission a reality, the EPA develops and enforces environmental regulations, gives grants to environmental programs, nonprofits, and educational institutions, identifies and tries to solve environmental problems, works with businesses, nonprofits, and state and local governments through dozens of partnerships, helps the public understand environmental issues. Over the past 40 years, some of the EPA's accomplishments include regulating auto emissions, banning the use of DDT, cleaning up toxic waste, protecting the ozone layer, increasing recycling, revitalizing inner-city brownfields. Protecting the environment from pollution is critical for the survival of our species and our planet. Environmental specialists are on the front lines of this important fight. They create and implement programs that promote environmental and workforce safety. Add certified environmental specialist certification to your resume and impress employers.
An area in upstate New York that the EPA investigated and found to be polluted with hazardous waste from nearby industries that was leading to birth defects and illnesses throughout the community. This was what was called the Love Canal. This was one of the early successes of the EPA. Oops.
I read a newspaper article and Love Canal had 20,000 tons of chemicals buried in it, and that it was leaking into the neighborhood. And I was like, oh my goodness. That's where Michael's going to kindergarten. That's why Michael's so sick.
Lois tried to get her son transferred to another school, but the superintendent refused.
When I met with Dr. Long, he said, I am not about to move 407 children because of one irate, hysterical housewife with a sickly kid.
Instead, Lois began to circulate a petition to close the school. She went door to door, discovering the extent of the damage.
I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. I thought I was the only one with a sickly child. I thought I was the only family that was affected by these leaking chemicals from Love
Canal. Another event that relates to the newfound EPA was a 3 Mile Island. In March 1979, the nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania, began melting down, and there was a threat of the release of radioactive gas and materials, although ultimately the threat was contained. This incident led to a public backlash and ban against nuclear power plants, and halted the building of more nuclear power plants until the ban was lifted in the 2000s.
It was the first step in a nuclear nightmare. As far as we know at this hour, no worse than that. But a government official said that a breakdown in an atomic power plant in Pennsylvania today is probably the worst nuclear reactor accident to date. There was no apparent serious contamination of workers, but a nuclear safety group said that radiation inside the plant is at 8 times the deadly level, so strong that after passing through a 3-foot thick concrete wall, it can be measured a mile away. Gary Shepard reports from Harrisburg.
The accident occurred here at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant a dozen miles south of Harrisburg. At about 4 o'clock this morning, 2 water pumps that help cool reactor number 2 shut down. Officials say some 50 to 60,000 gallons of radioactive water escaped into the reactor building, and that the radioactivity penetrated the plant's walls. Steam escaped into the atmosphere, and radiation was detected as far as a mile away. At least 50 workers, and perhaps twice that number, were at the plant when the accident occurred. A spokesman admitted that some were exposed to radioactivity and may have been contaminated, but he claimed no one was injured. All workers were given extensive checks with Geiger counters as they left the plant. Reporters were not permitted inside the facility today, but this is what reactor number 2's control room looked like last September when it was still undergoing testing. It went into commercial service only 3 months ago. Officials from Metropolitan Edison Company, which operates the plant, attempted to minimize the seriousness of the accident, saying the public was never in danger.
We may have some minor fuel damage, but we don't believe at this point that it's extensive. The radiation levels at the site boundary are really only a tenth of the general emergency level where we normally get concerned. We do have our crews out. We're monitoring for airborne contamination. The amount that we found is minimal. Very small traces of radioactivity have been released from the plant.
But the company's statements have not answered several important questions. How much radioactivity has already escaped from the plant? How high is the radiation level inside the plant? And is there still a high level of radioactive steam inside? The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has already begun a complete investigation into today's accident. Power company officials say it will be weeks, perhaps months, before reactor number 2 is back in operation. Gary Shepard, CBS News, Middletown, Pennsylvania.
Of course, in reaction to the EPA's activity in regulating for the sake of human health, businesses fight back and continue to fight back. The fact of the matter is businesses can make more profits if they don't have to clean up their messes. If they can just pour unhealthy things into our water supplies, it's cheaper for them. It's cuts into their profits when they have to clean up after themselves. Meanwhile, the public in those cases ends up paying the cost of business profits. if the public has to clean the water rather than the business that created the mess, this can be more expensive for the public, and it also puts public health at risk. And so there's this tug of war between businesses who want to make profits off of our health and the public who want to try their best to stay alive for as long as possible. And the industries continue to fight against environmental regulations, and they can afford to influence politicians with their deep pockets. They make a lot of profits, have quite a bit of money to influence politicians in a way that you and I, normal citizens, can't influence politicians because we don't have those deep pockets. And so we see every day this tug of war between big business and the public interest.